Ruby on Rails?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool. So this is like an intro class, right? Okay, cool. I can help TA and help you figure
Cool.
it out.
Thank you so much. I'm Samir.
Devin.
Devin, nice to meet you.
Cool.
Yeah. I know there's at least a couple folks there that were like, "Oh, we didn't install Rails. What do we do?" kind of thing. So
Okay.
you could maybe ask them.
Yeah.
But yeah, thanks, man.
Okay.
That'd be very helpful.
Cool. Is it like, I don't know if I've been to one of the intro ones. Is it like lecture format? Or?
I mostly like kind of lecture, and then let me actually share my screen and I'll show you. And then I like jump into the command line and start like doing Rails and stuff.
Okay.
But I'll usually like say like, I mean, I'll ask questions in between, and it depends on the people. Like sometimes there'll be a lot of like coders, PHP coders, Python coders, and they know the answers.
Yeah.
And sometimes people are like, I don't know.
Yeah.
So then I'll just kind of point to it.
Okay.
But people follow along and they get a sense of it, and then some folks might get stuck. Especially like anyone who has Windows machines, and if they have Rails installed,
Yeah, I was gonna say, like,
they'll have
really
Ruby.
hard to-
The problem is they'll have Rails 3 because Rails installer has Rails 3, I think.
They do have Rails 3 or they don't?
They do.
Okay.
But
And you're
the problem
teaching
is,
Rails 4?
yeah. So my file structure will be slightly different, so they might get stuck like,
Okay.
oh, where's the assets folder? Oh.
Right.
So yeah, you might get questions like that. But I'll let them know you are available.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, thanks, man.
Yeah, no
Do you know Gabe? How do you? Have you ever been-
I came to Sun like a long time ago.
Okay.
And then, yeah, I don't know. I'm just an Hammer Rails developer, so I was kind of like, I didn't want to do it after work, but I feel like if I can help people out. Then
Yeah, awesome. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I'll just get started. Okay. Well, I'm going to go with that resolution. Hopefully, everything will fit on the screen. Okay, we'll get started. My name is Samir, and thanks for coming for the Ruby on Rails intro class. We are lucky enough today to have a TA, Devin at the back with the glasses, has offered to TA. So if you have any questions as you follow along, feel free to also ask him. In case there's like two different questions, or if you have anything going on your machine, you want like help with that, he has offered to help. Thanks so much, Devin. So For those who have never been to Rails Noisebridge before, Noisebridge has a whole bunch of free classes like this. We do the Rails School, like there's 4 or 5 of us that teach it. I come back every couple of months to teach a beginner's class. The other guys teach like slightly more advanced topics. That's on Tuesday nights. There's also a really awesome front-end web development class taught by a guy named Jeff Fadden, which is incredible. I mean, it's like a real course, and it's free. And I would say you should definitely go. Liz Letty used to teach Python. I know she's taking a bit of a break, but if she ever starts her Python class again, I highly recommend that as well. Noisebridge is a nonprofit. It's all free, so think about donating money to Noisebridge and also buy awesome T-shirts. Cool. So I'm just going to jump in. I'll do some quick introductions just to get a sense of like where everyone's coming from. We'll try to spin up Ruby on Rails where possible. And let me know if I'm not loud enough. I know it's going to be a little hard. Feel free to move up if you want. So we'll try to have everyone follow along, and we'll try to keep it like pretty basic. And here are the concepts that I'll go over. As you can see, like I've put very little time towards front-end stuff. So HTML, CSS, we're not going to talk about that. We're going to talk more about the Ruby on Rails framework, which is more back-end as things go. So if we have time, we'll get to the front-end stuff, but I like to just sort of talk about data, how do you manipulate data using Ruby on Rails, and so on. This presentation is available online. So if you go to the website for this class on railsschool.org, you'll go to the bottom of the page. It says Show Whiteboard, and when you say Show Whiteboard, you'll open this up, and everything that I'll be saying, I'll be trying to type in there as well. So, but all the links are here. So the presentation is here. The code we're writing it's up on GitHub, and you can get it off of that. Cool. So I usually like to just go get a sense of like what does programming mean for you? Why are you interested in Ruby on Rails? Just anything, your favorite color, whatever you would like to share. I'll maybe start with Terrence, since I know your name.
Alright, well, I'm new to Rails. I tried to get a little bit, and here and there on YouTube videos, but I never formally got introduced to it. So I'm interested in creating back-end services for my whole life.
Cool.
I'm very new to this. I've just learned some of the front-end stuff already, but I need it for a site to start my business, so I need to know that.
Okay. And maybe
C++, actually never on Ruby.
okay. Frida.
Hey, Samir. My name is Frida, and my company is currently making an app. We built a prototype in Ruby on Rails, and I'm kind of excited to mess around with it and maybe optimize it a little more than it is.
Okay. Is that Zero Divide that you're talking about?
Yeah, we built a prototype for health insurance shopping app. It's really exciting.
Okay. Cool.
About it.
Yeah, I'd love to learn more.
I'm Nick, and it's my first foray into programming, and I work on a non-tech side company, and I'm hired product based on Ruby, so
Okay.
great place to start.
Yeah. Okay.
I'm Andre. I work with Nick, same company, but I'm also interested in Rails because I'm planning on building a web app in Rails for like quantitatively comparing rap lyrics.
Okay.
Maybe at the back.
Hi, my name is Deepti. This is my first time in any kind of programming. Computer. I am here actually just because
Cool.
And Joe, I have experience in programming, but not in Ruby, so
What sort of coding have you done? What sort of coding have you done? Like.
Oh, I work with Perl, Python, SQL, and not Java, not C++, not C++.
high level language, depending on the need.
Cool.
My name is Jake. I'm kind of like Joel. I'm a developer, but I'm typically from Microsoft Shop. And so I'm here just kind of running the production.
Like .NET, C Sharp.
.NET, C Sharp.
We're just doing intros. You want to tell us about your background in programming and what's your name?
So I just moved to San Francisco maybe 3-4 weeks ago. We're planning to settle into. But I've been teaching myself how to code Ruby on Rails for maybe like 6-7 months or something like that. Yeah.
Cool. What was your name?
Javier.
Javier.
J-A-V-I-E. Devin, I'm a web developer. I work in Ruby on Rails a lot, so I can try to help answer questions. Fair warning, I don't have a Windows machine, so you're probably going to be way worse at helping if you have a Windows machine. But I'll do what I can. I'll do it.
Virginia, and no background in programming whatsoever. Just did kind of like you and learning something new. I want to learn how to build websites. I'm a freelancer, so I'm trying to add onto my portfolio. I'm always been intrigued by building websites and
And you build websites using like?
Actually, I don't build websites yet, but I want to learn.
Okay. What was it Eugenia? Was your name Eugenia? Virginia. Okay. Cool. So I'll kind of get started. So most of you are like beginners. I know there's a couple of you that have coded before. My usual line is you don't need to know Ruby to start to learn Rails, but you will need to know Ruby pretty soon if you want to get serious. If you have any coding background at all, I will try to point out things that will make sense to you as a C++ programmer, as a Perl programmer. I will like point out, but because everyone is kind of beginners, I might not do that a lot. I will point out the tools much more than the programming concepts. Yeah. I'll try it. Yeah. Okay. Cool. So yeah. So for those of you that have coded, I will make some connections with what's going on, but most of it, it's a little bit like a fire hose. Like I'm just going to go through a lot of concepts to say like, hey, like here are all the things you can do, and then there's tons and tons of resources online, but hopefully it gives you a flavor for what's possible within 2 hours. Okay, so I'm a consultant. I do independent consultant on a bunch of things. I code for money essentially, and I like to help people that are just new to coding and want to help find ways to broaden computer literacy. There's a friend of mine and I that we are starting to come put together group sessions for folks. We have a plan to have sort of weekly mentoring. If you're learning to code, if you're interested, let me know. We're trying to form groups of coders that are all at the same level. Right now our plan is like 3 months, meet once a week, but set your own pace, work with someone you know, work with someone you work with, So we're trying to come up with a few models. We've been teaching, my friend and I have been teaching for about a year, so we have a curriculum around like beginners concepts in Rails. So feel free to email me, Samir at Rails School, and if you want to learn more. So for those of you that have Windows machines, Rails installer is still probably the easiest way to get started, but I will warn you that it is way out of date. Okay, the guys who are writing Rails installer, I guess, have not been able to update it, and so it's getting to the point where you really will have to find other ways of doing it. There is a Ruby installer, and that gets you as far as Ruby, but then you still have to install Rails by yourself. So it's not, Windows machines are unfortunately not the best for Ruby, Python, Rails web development. A Macintosh is much better. I have, like, this machine is like 5 years old and it's doing quite fine. I got it for like $600, so price point wise, like, you can get a cheapish Mac machine and it'll be fine. You don't need the latest Mavericks machine. So So I think it's okay. But if you have Windows for now, use Rails installer. It'll get you going, but you'll run into issues pretty soon. Like libraries that are written for Rails tend more and more, so you'll start to fall behind the curve. Yeah.
The current Rails bridge instructions, they tell you to type install Rails and install Rails or something. So.
Yeah, so if you go through the Rails bridge curriculum, which is also linked to from, I think, one of my notes, I forget. But Rails bridge is another, nothing to do with NoiseBridge. They are an organization that work in like equity issues in technology, like underrepresented groups, minorities, women. So especially the women amongst you, like check them out. They're pretty awesome. But yeah, they have a pretty good like list of installation instructions, and it does walk you through a lot of the steps. I think they also have much better instructions for OS X, for Mac, than for Windows, I think, if I remember correctly. Okay, I will be using the command line a lot, which is, you might have heard of it as command prompt, or terminal, or shell, or DOS prompt if you use Windows. Anyone here that is not familiar with it or thinks it's really complicated, you might have heard about it, but it's been like annoying, difficult to learn? Yes, no? Command prompt, like are you comfortable using like text commands to navigate your computer? Okay, cool. So that makes one thing easier. So I'll be using the command prompt entirely. I also edit my files using a text editor called Emacs. So I don't use any GUI, like visual editors at all. So you'll see like my screen is going to be a whole lot of text rather than a whole lot of windows. So if any of that is confusing, let me know, and I'll stop and try to explain kind of what's going on. Okay, but since no one web programming works, and a lot of the basics of how web programming works map pretty directly to how the Rails framework is set up. So it's helpful to know that, because then it becomes much more helpful to understand how Rails is set up. Okay. So the most simple thing about any web application is that there are 4 parts to how you access it. There is the domain or the server that the application runs on. And every time you access the server, you will be typing in what is called a URL. Right? You might have heard like, hey, type in this URL into the address bar. It's what you type it into your browser. And the URL consists of the domain. It consists of this piece, which comes after the domain name, after the first slash. And optionally, it consists of what are called query parameters. Query parameters are separated from the path by a question mark, and they are written in pairs of keywords which are separated by the equal to and the and sign, like this. So there are 2 pairs. The first pair says Q equal to something. The second pair says SRC equal to something. And in each of these pairs, the left-hand side of the equals to is called the key, and the right-hand side is called the value. So the query parameters with pairs of keys and values. Then there's a 4th part which you don't type into the address bar yourself, but that your browser will still be sending to the application, which is called the method or the verb. And that's usually hidden from you when you're typing in a URL into the browser, but there are ways of using a browser to figure out what verbs or methods are being sent by the browser to the application. Okay? So I'll be using these words a lot. I'll be like, oh, what's the method now? What's the URL? What's the route? So I just wanted to like separate out those pieces and show what's going on. So just a little bit of explanation. Like I said, so browsers have tools that help you visualize that. So let's actually look at an example. If I go to Google, I'm using Firefox here. Chrome also has a similar tool, but basically you can open up something in Firefox if you just right-click in the window, you can say Inspect Element, and then select the Network tab. And if I then type in a query into the box, you'll notice that down here, it's giving you a whole lot of information about what's going on. And one of the pieces of information it gives you is the method. So there's a whole lot of get commands. What this shows you is, in fact, this page is generated not just by one request, but by a whole multitude of requests. Okay? And that's what happens with any application. It's what happens with the Rails application as well. And we'll see a little bit about how Rails manages that for you. So you're not actually having to write all of the different pieces that need to respond to the browser when you're creating the app, because Rails will sort of put that together for you. So, but that's kind of how you would get to looking at this. And usually, once you start programming, you're programming your applications. This profiler becomes your friend because you'll start to use it to detect if there's a bug, if the application is not doing what you think it should do. What is the browser sending to the application? Is there a problem with what the browser has been designed to send, and are you not responding to the right request? So to know what are the requests coming from the browser, you can use these tools. So in Firefox, if you right-click on the window, just say Inspect Element. For those of you that have done any programming, there's also a plugin for Firefox called Firebug, which gives you much more detailed information. So you can either use this built-in inspector, or you can install an add-on called Firebug. In Chrome, you can look under Tools and then start something called Developer Tools, and that does the same thing. Okay. So, jumping back, let me just make a couple of notes. How to get to Developer Tools. Okay. Okay, so basically starting from here, the basic Rails setup that we will try to walk through with the rest of the class is this. There is a file called the routes file, which has a list of all of the requests that your application will handle. Okay, so the routes file will say, I will handle certain requests. I will know what to do when those requests come in. Each of those requests, or the routes, or the URIs, the routes file maps them to what are called controller action pairs, which is essentially the code that you write. Okay, so there's a pattern that says when you see a URL, when you see a request that looks like this, here's the code that you need to run. That code has a way to read the query parameters, and then it uses that information in the query parameters to generate something called a view. And the view is pretty much where you put all of your HTML. That is pretty much the loop of how Rails works. The HTML is what goes back to the browser, and browsers know how to render HTML into something that we like to see inside the browser window. Did you have a question, Virginia? No. So the one piece that is not part of what I'm calling the minimum Rails setup is that there's nothing in here that talks about how the data itself is accessed. Your application is going to be storing data. Most applications, you will be storing data somewhere. People log in, users have passwords, people have profiles, photographs, they buy products. So you got to store that data somewhere. But you can set up a Rails app without any data. The minimum setup doesn't require data. All it requires is code that responds to requests. Okay? So you could have an app that simply tells you the time of the day. You go to the app and you say my app / what's the time in the browser, and it says the time is whatever it is, right? No data. All it does is one thing. And that you can do that in Rails. So you can write a Rails app without actually having any database behind it. So this is just a visual representation. Like I said, the browser will send all of this information. There will be a pattern inside something called a routes file that will then depict or denote where the code is. That code will come from a specific file, and we'll look at these files and what they look like and all of that. The code that you write will pass on certain data to the view file that generates the HTML that goes back to the browser. Okay, so that's the basic Rails loop. Okay, so how many folks here actually have Rails running on your?
I think I do.
Oh, okay. Okay, so you all should be able to open up the command prompt and follow along. So let me go to where I have all of my code. And what I'm going to do is I'll just keep that up there. So what I'm going to do is the first step in, over here. Okay, I'm going to have to jump back and forth a bit. So most of your beginning Rails, you will have to get very familiar with just two commands, Rails and rake. Rails is the Rails command. Once you have Ruby on Rails installed, your system will have access to these two commands. The Rails command is used to do those things: create the application, start up your server, and then automate a lot of different things. We'll see what they are. And then the rake command is used to do a bunch of other things. There's no real reason why there are two different commands and not just one, but there are. So you just have to kind of get used to which command is what. Okay. So I'm going to start with Rails. I'm going to create an application, and if you all have Rails and everything is cool, and if it's not, Devin should be able to help you out. You should be able to type in Rails space new space, and I'm going to give a name to this app. Okay. Let's just call it Noise Bridge app. Be able to type that in. At the very least, you should see a bunch of this stuff, and then you should see bundle install at the end. Did anyone not see even this initial screen? Yes.
What was the command that you typed?
Rails space new. I'll show you. There you go. Rails space new, and then the name of your app. Okay. Anyone had the screen stop at bundle install and then give an error?
I have a question.
Yeah.
What are we going to build out today?
Oh, I'll get to that in just a minute. Hold that thought. I have like this app which is like.
I just want to make sense of like where my level makes sense.
Oh right. Yeah. Well, I'll try to go like.
If not, I can just listen and
yeah, you probably will want to work on something else, but I'll show you what I'm going to do. And yeah. And towards the end, I might try to go a little bit faster so that maybe like you can actually pick up some stuff. But I'm happy to answer some questions if you have after.
I just want to ask a question.
Okay. Yeah, just give me a minute. Yeah.
So I just tried to make a new app, and it says DL and deprecated. Please use middle. And it says
what? No, yes, Windows. That sounds like a library linking problem. That sucks. I haven't used Windows in a while, so I don't know. So yeah, maybe Devin can help you out. Okay, everyone else got past the bundle install? Yes, that is awesome. Okay, just one casualty so far, and hopefully Terrence will be back on track. Okay, once you run that, what you should see is that a new folder has been created with the same name as the app name that you just created. Okay, so is it the same error?
No, it's a little bit different.
Interesting.
Okay. Because I have Devin today, I'm going to keep moving. I'll take advantage of that. So I'm going to change into that folder. One of the things you have to know is that whenever you do anything with your app, you have to be at least at the top level of the app folder that you just created. So if I look inside Finder, so you'll see that here's where I created the folder. Rails created a whole bunch of other stuff for me. Okay, so we obviously cannot get through most of this today, but one of the advantages of Rails is that a lot of the framework gets set up for you. Okay, so a lot of the database access methods get set up for you. A lot of the test code gets set up for you. The initial database gets set up for you, and so it gives you a lot off the ground, that gets you off the ground really fast. But then the downside is that you have to know exactly what Rails set up for you, and you have to follow the convention that Rails sets up. Okay? There's a reason that these folders are called what they're called, and you can't rename them. If you rename any of these folders, your app will stop working. Okay? So you have to remember that a lot of what Rails is about is what is called convention over configuration. Okay, so you can't change a lot of things about Rails. You just have to know that they work a certain way. But because you're following convention, it means every Rails app is going to look very similar. And it's very easy to look at someone else's Rails app and sort of be like, oh, like I know what's going on because it follows convention. Okay, so it's like both an upside and a downside. Okay, so to answer Jake's question, what I'm going to do is inspired by, but obviously cannot get anywhere as close to the actual app, this website, where if you type in a city, over here it tells you who's the mayor of the city. So we're going to write a toy app that does this. Much of what's going on here involves HTML and CSS, and we're not going to do that, so we're not going to have a very fancy-looking site, but we'll try to have something that you can type in the name of the city, and at the least it says the mayor is. Okay, and I'll try to explain some concepts. So like I said, this is the domain name. This is the route. And these are query parameters. Every web application essentially looks the same. Okay? And sometimes you'll see there's no query parameter. That's because it's hidden. But there still are query parameters, and they still are being passed by the browser to the application. There are ways of setting it up so that they don't show up in the browser address bar, but they still are there. So that is a common concept for all web applications. So notice that I don't actually have to use the search bar. I mean the search box. I can change the value of a query parameter, and it's as if I typed something in here. Right? So you're basically programming the browser or programming the application by changing the query parameters. So I will be like talking, Jake, I don't know if this answers your question, but I'll be trying to like talk about the concepts that go into like how do you set up your app to do something like that. So within the Rails framework, basically. Okay, so like I said, the first thing is you're going to set up a pattern inside your routes file. So I just want to go over this a little bit because this comes up a lot in understanding how Rails works. So in your Rails application, there is going to be a folder called config, which contains a lot of configuration information. But your config folder is where there's a file called routes. inside the routes file, you're going to write commands like which will be in this format. And what this format says is that this is a pattern which it will use to match the URLs that are coming into the application. And what this pattern says is, given a URL that starts with /city and optionally contains the remaining part of the URL in this format, then run code which is denoted by the rest of this. Okay, so for example, if I want my app to say, to show me the mayor, and the way I want it to do that is I'm going to type in /city/show/mayor. Okay, so I want to say something like /city/ and then the name, maybe the name of the city, and then I want to say mayor, and that should give me the mayor, right? So I want my app to do something like this: myapp.com, city, San Francisco, mayor, and I want it to show me the mayor of San Francisco. If I said myapp.com and I did that, I wanted to show me the mayor of Oakland.
Okay. Are we going to do it that way, or are we going to do it with the little keys and values?
Both. We'll do little bits of both, just to kind of get a sense of how one works and how the other works. Okay. So that's how I want it to work. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to set up this command inside my routes file, which will basically, sorry, I keep doing that, which will basically say, when I see a URL in this pattern, do something. Okay? And that's just the way I'm writing, that's just the way Rails requires you to write the pattern. Okay? What Rails does is that, and we'll see how it does this, it takes the pieces of the URL that match each of these words with a colon in front of it and gives you a way of accessing them in your code. And we'll see how it does that. Okay, but that's basically what is happening, is that the pattern is saying, do a match on the URL and then store the matched pieces in a given variable. Okay, so I guess this is kind of the first place where, like, I'm assuming you have a little bit of understanding of programming, what are variables, what happens when you store data in variables. Is that confusing to anyone? I can try and like talk about what that means. Otherwise, I can start coding.
We don't have any variables yet, right?
We don't, but I'll show you how like this colon action, colon position like translates into an actual variable. And if you're not sure about what variables are, that might be a little confusing, but I'll try to explain it if it gets confusing. So I'm going to start coding. I'm going to open up my text editor, and I'm going to open up the routes file. You can open this file in any text editor you like, Notepad+, whatever, but hopefully you can follow along as I type in. So I'm going to say here's my pattern, and it's going to be a little bit different than what I typed into the presentation.
So for those who don't have text editors, maybe it's like people really need programming, like text editor. You know what I mean?
What was the question? Like for
a lot of people might not be familiar with text editor programming, so like
yeah, I mean.
Or unless Macs come with.
Macs come with their own text editors. Yeah, they do. But yeah, like I would say, if you're not comfortable with using text editors, use. Let me just finish typing that. Either you can use Notepad. Macs come with TextEdit. You can use any one of those. But the benefit of using a lot of text editors is that they come with a lot of support for coding. They help like indent your code for you. They also call syntax highlighting, which is showing like different pieces of code in different colors to kind of depict what's going on. For example, in this text editor, all these lines which are comments are shown in red. So I know right away by looking at the color that they are they're comments. If you're serious about coding, I would recommend a text editor called Sublime Text. That's my recommended text editor. That's not the only one out there. There's one that is specific to Ruby called RubyMine, Ruby and Rails called RubyMine. It comes with a lot of like drop-down like menu items for doing a lot of things, which I'm going to be doing in the command line. But in RubyMine, you can sort of say select, drop-down. It also completes a lot of things for you, so you can sort of say Rails, and then like we did, I typed in Rails and then I typed in new. But in RubyMine, you just type in N and it says, oh, you mean new? You know, so it like makes life slightly easier. The thing about using the command line is that over time, as you start to look for help online, way more people use the command line and will give you help to use the command line than things like Sublime Text and RubyMine. So you'll start to find like it's a balance. Like yes, using Sublime Text is a lot easier. It's a nice little like application, but it's a little if you get as with text editors, you can sort of find help faster. But both Sublime Text and RubyMine come with a lot of really great support for our developers. So I would say definitely look into both of those. This is shareware. But I think it's like $80. They keep popping up a message if you don't pay them. RubyMine, I think, also is shareware, and it's like $100. And all text editors are free, pretty much. So that's another advantage. Save a little money. Okay, so what did I do here? I said get city, and then I said here's a pattern. So if I see a URL that looks like /city/something/something, I'm going to run this code. So now my application is ready to run this code when it gets a request in this pattern. Okay. Note that. So here's kind of the first place where if you know Ruby, you'll know what's going on. If you don't know Ruby, you kind of have to just write it this way. If you know Ruby, what's actually happening here is that it's a method call to a method called get, which is being passed a key value, like a hash, basically. So actually, this is the same as typing this in. So anyone that has coded in Perl or Python, it's basically a method to which you're passing in a hash, which has the pattern and the code location. And in Ruby, because of various ways in which Ruby gives you a convenience in terms of how you type your code, you can drop a lot of stuff. So those two things are the writing, whether I put these like brackets and parentheses or not, the behavior is the same. It's a little bit easier to read it this way. Ruby on Rails also has what is called a domain-specific language, which means that a lot of the commands in Ruby on Rails try to map to like their real-world like English equivalents. So you can kind of read that as if it's like an English sentence, and it is saying, get, in response to this, code that is in here. Right? So it's kind of like visually also telling you what's going on. And at least as a beginner, I think it's helpful because it helps you remember like the patterns. But it's actually just Ruby code. There's nothing special going on. If you know Ruby, you'll know why it's written that way. Otherwise, you can kind of remember the pattern. Okay, so that's the only change I made. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to open another window, go back to where my application was, and from the window, from the command line, you should be able to type in Rails space server. And remember, anytime you run Rails or rake commands, you have to be at least at the level, at least in this folder. You can be anywhere below that, but you have to be at least within the folder of your Rails app. That folder is commonly referred to as the Rails root. So a lot of times people will, if you're looking for help online, they'll say, go to the Rails root and run this. Or find a folder in the Rails root that looks like this. And the first message I got tells me that there's already a server running somewhere. Let me kill my existing application, and close down this window. And okay. Ignore that. That was not supposed to happen. I forgot to shut down something I was already running. So if you're running Rails 4, you should all see, and if you have done nothing fancy on top of your Rails application already, you should see this message, and you should see this message, and all this. Anyone ran this and found an error? Did you guys get the bundle working? Great.
Yeah.
Command, did it run correctly? When earlier? Oh, let me take a quick look. It might not have. Okay, that gives you an error. My last step. So one thing that I kind of glossed over was I said that there's Rails and rake commands, but there is another one called bundle. And for those of you that ran into the problem or will run into the problem at some point, what bundle does is that it takes your Rails app and it looks at all of the libraries that your Rails app is using, and it makes a record of that. And the reason it makes a record is so that you can take your Rails app to someone else's machine and duplicate exactly the Rails setup that you have on your machine. So it's a way of managing code across multiple machines. Sometimes bundle fails to do that because it tries to install a library and that library did not exist. And Mac OS X machines are pretty good at coming pre-configured with a lot of the libraries that you need when you're coding Rails. Windows machines are not very good at that, so it's a little harder. So usually getting past bundle install is like a fairly big barrier for most beginners. Yeah, so hopefully you won't run into that again. But as you add more and more libraries, you'll start to see sometimes you'll have trouble using bundle install. So did it run? It's still running. Okay. Yeah. The reason it takes a while is because it actually has to check every library that it wants. It has every default Rails application comes with 25 libraries that it wants. So it has to check through all of them on your system, and it takes a while to do the initial bundle. Okay, so hopefully everyone has seen this. Note that it says down here port equal to 3000. So applications also come with another piece which I left out in my initial description, which is not just the domain name, that is the machine on which it's running, but something called a port. You can run multiple applications on the same machine. Obviously, they all run in the same domain, but they can run at different ports, which are kind of like addresses. Okay, so it's like having apartment numbers in a building. By default, all applications run on port 80, which is why you don't actually have to type it in here. I don't have to say port 80 because the browser assumes that if I don't give a port, it's going to try and find the application at port 80. When you're running your Rails application locally, it will run on port 3000, not on port 80. Okay. How you access an application that's running locally is you type in localhost in your browser, and then I type in the port number after that. So if you all got past this screen, you should be able to go to your browser, type in localhost :3000, and something should happen. You should see this message, hopefully. At the very least, you should not see a message that says server is not responding or can't find application. You should see this message. Anyone not see this? Okay. So I said that my application should respond to URLs that are in this pattern. So if I go back to my code, oops, sorry. If I go back to my code, here's the pattern. I said /city followed by /something followed by /something. So I said city, Oakland, mayor. :3000, and then can you type in this address in your browser bar? Did the bundle finish? And you get it all? Awesome. Okay, we're all on track. It's great.
Mine says no route connections. Is that still right?
Yeah, so you might be, Simone and Terrence, you hopefully are the only people with this that you're running an older version of Rails than I'm running.
Okay.
Everyone else, if you just installed Rails, like in the last week or so, like you should all see exactly the same messages on. Just change as new versions of Rails are released. So hopefully you're seeing like this stuff. Are you seeing this stuff?
Yes.
Okay, yeah. So you probably have like Rails 3 maybe. That's why I have Rails 4.
Okay.
So that might be why.
I thought it did. Download before because it was from the site.
Okay. Well, I have 4.1. You might have 4.0. Yeah. So there's all kinds of version problems. Okay. So basically, what this is saying is that I know that I should respond to this, but I can't. You said I would be able to find it. That's essentially what's happening. So remember we said here there's going to be some code, but we didn't write any code. Okay, so obviously it's like, where's the code? And the way it interprets this is, where did I put that? My bad. Is using this convention. Okay, so I'm going to keep coming back to this slide, but every route is essentially in this format. Here's the pattern. When you match the pattern, my code is there are two things you need to know to locate the code. One is what I'm going to call the handler, and one is the action. The handler is going to be in a file whose name has to look like this. And it has to be in the folder app controllers. So if I go back to where all my folders are that got created, notice there's a folder called app, and there's a bunch of folders that I created. And Rails says, if you tell me to look for a handler, I'm going to use the name of the handler and expect to find a file with that name in this folder. Okay? So I am going to go to that folder, and I'm going to create a file called city controller. Because in my route file, I said that the handler is city. I will open that file and
City controller.rb.
Yes, I should have said that. Citycontroller.rb. We'll expect to find a Ruby file, and .rb stands for Ruby, with that name. Okay, so convention or configuration. You have to just remember this, and you can't do it any other way. You're not allowed to call it city handler file, city code file. It's not allowed. You have to call it the things Ruby Rails expects you to call it. Okay, and inside that, Rails expects you to write some Ruby code in a very specific format. Mainly, it expects you to create this piece. Notice how the name of the handler is both in the name of the class as well as in the name of the file, but with one difference. The name of the class has to start with an uppercase, and there is no space or anything between the name of the class, the name of the handler, and the word controller. In the file name, it has to be lowercase, and there has to be an underscore. Okay? Again, convention. You can't do it any other way. If the name of the file is this, the name of the class has to be this. For those of you that are programmed in Java and C++, you can probably understand what's going on. We're using Ruby's object-oriented language functions. We're creating a class definition, and the class definition is inheriting from something called application controller. If you don't know programming, what's happening here is essentially you're saying, I'm going to write some code, and it's going to rely on a lot of stuff that Rails has already provided to you. So this code is going to work in certain magical ways because it's relying on how Rails already works. And one of the pieces that Rails gives you is this application controller, which does a lot of behind-the-scenes work for you. If you've done any programming and you understand object-oriented programming, you're inheriting a class. The class has a bunch of, obviously, interfaces defined for you, which you can then take advantage of. Okay, so that's kind of what's going on.
I lost that file. You created that file, or
yes.
Did you open it?
I created that file. So in this folder, controllers was created for me, but I created a file called city_controller. Okay. That's all I'm going to do, and then I'm going to go back to my browser and refresh it, and you should all see your error message change.
Show me one more time where do you create the city controller?
So I created the file in this folder called controllers.
Can you show again how to do the command line?
Yeah, in the command line, to create a file, you say greater than, and then the name of the file. And it creates a blank file for you.
And we're already in the
Yeah, you can see my prompt shows you which folder I'm in. Yeah. So. Okay, so has anyone gotten to the screen? See a couple of heads nodding. So hopefully if you created the file and if you put this code in here, what's the error?
Runtime error in city controller, show mayor, circular dependency detected while auto-loading constant city controllers.
Wow. Oh, circular dependency. Did you write like city controller less than application controller? Yeah? Circular dependency.
Yeah. Wow, your guess is good. I mean, everything looks fine. So, yeah. Okay, so you shouldn't have to be like we started.
Yeah. So that's actually so
But you discovered something else. Okay. So Joel, was that Joel? No, you're not Joel. You're Joel. So we discovered something that I usually don't bring up, which is that all the whenever you're making these changes, you usually don't have to restart your server. But you were using someone else here who's using Windows found that a change they made required the server to be restarted. So that's one thing to remember. Like when you're developing code, usually you don't have to restart the server. You just keep changing code, and you can keep seeing the effects in the browser window. One place to start, if you're seeing something like that's like totally unexplainable, is just restart the server and see if that helps, right? So how you restart the server usually is you hit Control-C in the window where you have it running, and then just run it again. So just a tip, I won't be doing this because that usually shouldn't happen, but it looks like something weird happened with his Windows machine. Yeah, well, but then it did change the error once you restart the server, even before you saved it, yeah. So something weird in Windows, which I'm not going to worry myself too much about. Okay. So has everyone gotten to a point where you have a message that says something like this? Should not be found.
No, I think I'm missing the last command line command.
So did you create the file and then type this in? You did. And then what's the error you're seeing?
No, what it means that I know that you wrote like command. The last thing, the command lines that I missed.
Oh, I just restarted my server. I didn't make any other changes, so maybe that's what. Also, is that a Windows machine too, by the way?
No.
It's Linux. Oh, Ubuntu. Okay. Yeah, that's all I did.
Okay.
Okay. Did you have to restart as well? Oh, you didn't. Okay. Okay. So if you see that message, basically it's the next step. It's saying that it was able to find the handler, but not the action. So if I go back to where my code is, my routes file, I have a handler, I have an action, I have defined the handler, but I've not defined the action. And the way you define the action is to go back to your controller file and type in the following.
You say your routes file?
Yeah.
Great, thanks.
Yeah. Okay, so again, if you know Ruby, what you're doing is adding a method definition inside your class definition. That's all that's going on. If you don't know Ruby, you're basically adding the action with the handler. So go back to here. You're saying handler action. It has to say def and then the name of the action. And this is where you're actually going to do something. And inside this code, I'm going to do something here. And if you got that code, then when you refresh, now you should see a different error message, which is the final piece of to catch up. And now basically it's saying missing template. So in Rails, the views files are also called template files. And I'm not going to go into the exact difference right now, but basically what it is saying is that this piece is missing. So we started here, we wrote this, and now we have to actually generate the HTML that is going to be put back inside the browser, right? Again, convention. Your controller files go into the folder called controllers. Your views file go into a folder called views. But inside your folder called views, you have to create another folder whose name is the same as the name of the handler, which is what I'm going to do. So I'm going to go to my views file, and I'm going to create a new folder here, and it is going to be called city. So that's basically the convention of the full Rails loop. You define the handler and the action in your routes file. The name of the handler has to carry through into the controller and the views file in this way, and the name of the action has to carry through from the routes file to the action method to the name of the template file. Okay, so is everyone with me as far as creating the views/city folder is concerned? And then inside city, I have to create another file. So then I'm going to go back to the command line to do this. So now I'm inside the city folder, and in there, I'm going to create a file whose name starts with the action. So here's the action piece. And then it ends in the extension .html.erb. So for now, don't worry too much about what that is. Yes?
There isn't a city folder, yes, right? We make one?
You have to make one. Yeah. So under views, you have to make a folder that corresponds to the handler that you just specified. And when you create the file, you have to give it an extension of .html.erb. So
So we type in CD city after we type in the CD views?
Yes. And in the command line, the way you create a blank Okay, so notice that it did create the 0-byte file for me. If you've done any PHP programming, basically what you're going to do is you're going to write HTML and Ruby code mixed together. So just like in PHP, you can mix in PHP code with HTML. In Ruby, if your file has an extension called .brb, it is allowed to have Ruby code inside the HTML file. That's what's going on. I'm not actually going to look into that too much today, like all of the ways in which you can introduce code inside your Ruby files, because we're going to not worry about the front end pieces too much. Okay, so I'm going to open that now in my text editor, and in here I'm just going to have a simple message that says hello world. And if I do that and I go back and refresh my browser screen, I now have that show.
Can you go back and show us?
So I opened the showmayor file, and all I did was type in hello world inside the file.
Inside the city file?
Inside the city, no, inside the showmayor.html.erb file. So inside this file. So if you go to views, city, and then this file.
Oh, so the showmayor HTML is inside the folder city that we created.
Okay, so most folks gotten to where if you go back to your browser and refresh, you see the message. You don't see it. What did it say? So what was the message you got, Frida?
I think there's a round count. It's not sending it out.
Oh.
think I did, yeah. A lot of. I never actually had oh, that's weird.
Okay, I'll wait for like folks to catch up here. Yeah.
I used a button that made it so that now when I type, needs the stuff right there, it's instantly rather than like inserting new characters. You know, oh, that's just
I don't use Sublime a lot, so I'm not very familiar, but
you're overwhelming. Yeah. Yeah. That's just insertion. Wait.
Okay, how many folks have gotten this far? Yes? Yes? Frida? No? Routes? You got the routes fixed? Okay.
I think this is another application. Yeah, so the problem I'm not giving myself a lot. You can't follow on. I can help you out, but I'll make a note of something.
Okay. Okay, so just more proof that trying to code on Windows can be a bit of a bear if you're a beginner. Hopefully everyone else is caught up. Yeah. Yes, it is. It is on Google Air, Hangouts, and I have put this link on the whiteboard. Okay, so I'll just keep, I think most of you are on there. I'm going to keep moving a little bit. So basically we got the views file. We got basically what is in the views file is now showing up in my browser. Notice that I typed in only this into the views file, but if I look at the source of the file, so I just pulled up the source for this, which you can do by right-click and view page source in Firefox. You'll see that there's actually a lot of other stuff that has been added. If you've done HTML programming, you'll know that you need to have a body tag, you need to have a head tag. Some of these might make sense. Here's the title tag that gives you the title of the web page. A lot of this is being added by Rails over and above the views file that you created. So your views file was only responsible for this piece in here, and then Rails kind of packages it inside a bunch of HTML that all HTML pages should have. So one of the benefits of using Rails is that you don't have to remember to insert a doc type at the beginning. You don't have to remember to put the HTML tag at the beginning and at the end, because Rails will do that for you.
So I inject all the jQuery imports and everything.
Yes.
What if you wanted to like change the version of jQuery you reference it? Is that possible?
Yes. So I'll answer those questions by saying first, yes. Notice that it did insert certain JavaScript files. Notably, it inserts jQuery. So Rails comes with certain default assumptions that, hey, jQuery is used across the world. Everyone loves it. You're probably going to end up using it. So hey, I'm just going to throw it in there for you. Right now, we're not using jQuery. We're not doing any JavaScript programming. But Rails comes out of the box with a lot of these things kind of thrown in, assuming that anyone who writes a web application in the 21st century uses jQuery. So that's why I threw it in. How would you change that? I'm going to answer your question. This is not really important for like following on in this class, but you'll notice that in the views folder, there's a folder Rails created called layouts, and if I open this file, that's where all the stuff is. Not really, because then you're like, hey, wait a minute, it says the JavaScript include tag. Where is the JavaScript include for jQuery? So you would have to then figure out actually how the rest of it works, but it's basically being controlled by the layouts file. So kind of answer your question. But there's still like, you have to still figure out why it inserts, where it inserts the jQuery specifically. How do you understand the JavaScript tag and how does that behave and so on. So, okay, so those of you that know HTML, you know what I'm doing here. I'm adding more tags. This is just like an HTML file. This is my views file. And as I add stuff and I refresh, it just shows up. Okay? So I'm just going to add more and more. The mayor of your city is not yet. This code is okay, so that's just standard HTML. I type that in, I refresh the screen, and you can see that it's starting to show up. Okay. So if you know HTML, then all you're doing in your views file is you're writing HTML. Okay, so hopefully we have mostly all come here, because this is really where like some of the coding starts, and we'll sort of start to like really figure out how to like, I mean, this app is not doing anything because it doesn't even know that I'm asking for the mayor of Oakland, right? Like this app is pretty dumb right now. So the first step we'll take towards actually writing some code is writing a little bit of code here. And the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to say this. Actually, hold on. City name. Okay, so basically I wrote a little bit of Ruby code, and to figure out what happened, let me go back to my presentation to like this screen. So sorry that my route here is not exactly what I'm using in my actual application. Hopefully you'll follow along. So I said, here's my get pattern. And I said, when I see a URL that looks like /city/something/something, Rails is going to match the pattern, and it is going to take what's in here and assign it to a variable that is defined inside the pattern. Actually, it's not going to assign it to the variable. It is going to assign it to a hash called params. Okay? And the way it shows up is in your code, you get to say if params and then this square bracket sign, city name. Params basically, so if you don't know coding, params becomes like this bucket that contains all the information that was passed in to the URL. Okay? If you've coded before in any language, params is basically a hash data structure or a dictionary data structure, and it is going to get populated with keys that match the keys you specify in your route pattern. So what I did in my route here is I said the keys are city name and position. And I said when you see a URL in this pattern, take those keys and assign them to the params hash. So in this URL, the key Oakland inside my params hash, sorry, the key city name inside my params hash will be set to the value Oakland. The key position for the params hash will get set to mayor. And so in my code, I'm saying if the key city name is set to Oakland, then assign the value Jean Quan to the variable mayor name. Okay. All of that is just Ruby code. Again, if you know Ruby, like it becomes obvious what you're writing. The only thing that is not obvious is why is this bucket called params? And that's all part of the Rails convention. So Rails basically says, by convention, I'm going to take your URLs, and I'm going to break it up and give it to you in code in certain ways. And you have to know in what way it's coming to you inside the code. Okay. Then what I can do is go back to my city views file, and I can now insert Ruby code in here like this. Okay. So let me walk you through each of these pieces. If you're using any editor that does syntax highlighting, when you type this in, it should show different things in different colors. That's where syntax highlighting will be helpful. So the thing you need to focus on is this part. Okay, this line. So it looks kind of like HTML, but not exactly. You're opening a tag, but then you say %, and you type something in the middle, and then you close it with a %. So it kind of looks like an HTML tag, but there is a special character called %. And basically what you're doing is that you're inserting Ruby code inside your HTML file. So if you're familiar with PHP, that's anyone who's done PHP programming, this is kind of like writing PHP code like this. Okay, so if you've done PHP programming, this is exactly what you're doing, but now you're doing it with Ruby. So the rest of this is just plain old HTML. But then in the middle of the HTML, I have inserted Ruby code. And notice that the variable name that I set in my controller is accessible in my view. This one?
Yes.
So I'm going to wait there for you to like catch up with the coding. And like soon enough, like as you write stuff, like you can see that being able to decipher that, you have to know some Ruby, or you have to like know some programming. And I've been kind of going slow, but we'll spend the last half an hour talking about some of the things in Rails where like you can get away without knowing to program, but then you always like, I mean, pretty much any like online course you take will like force you to learn a little bit of Ruby, just enough to like keep up with what's going on. But I would seriously recommend, like, if you're learning Rails, just learn Ruby. Everything will get a whole lot easier if you know what that program actually is doing in Ruby. Okay, so I said if params is equal to Oakland, mayor name is Jean Kwan, and if it's not, then I'll say mayor name equal to, I don't know. Okay. What I could do with this code is I can also copy paste it, because it's a lot of code, into the whiteboard, and maybe that might be a little bit easier. So feel free to take it from the whiteboard if you want, which is up here on the Rails School webpage. But if I now go back to my browser app and I refresh it, I got Jean Kwan. Okay. Does that make sense? Any questions? Do folks want to take 5 minutes to catch up? I put the code up here, so if you copy this code into your controller file and then make this one change in your view file, you should all be able to catch up with that as well. Is there what? Oh, I mean, I know there are convenience stores over on 16th. It's like a block and a half away. There's one like on 16th, like just past Mission. I know. Okay, so so that's basically the 3 essential steps. Did folks have any questions? Have people caught up till here?
What's the meaning of the little @ sign before their name under city controller?
So the answer, like if you don't know coding, is just do it that way. When you're trying to set up variables that you want to share between the controller and the view, just have them start with an @ sign.
Okay.
The answer, if you know object-oriented programming, is that @ in Ruby gives you instance variables for your class objects. I think in C++ or Java they're called instance variables.
Okay.
So what is happening actually is that your view code is running within the context of the city controller class, and it therefore has access to all of the instance variables of the controller class. So you're basically setting the instance variable in your controller, and you're using it in your view.
So if you set any regular Ruby variables here, they won't show up.
That will not show up in the view. Yes.
I've been unable to get even a little position.
Oh, no.
Rear arrow. I even didn't get that, and then it just depends on how much.
Easiest way to get
Copy this, make a new one.
They're just trying to help you refresh.
Get out this.
You should have thought of that.
I can't do the save files and text it. And then save.
Yeah, just change generate. That's weird. Yeah.
I would say new.
It would make us
Make sure that you have a very good text education. And I would say the note right stuff.
You get toggles between those two arrows.
You can only save.
Which sucks. Text edit. I thought text edit works.
I did download Emacs, so just trying to install it.
Yeah, is that Sublime Text is also probably the easiest solution. Like it gives you like a nice interface, but you don't have to learn Emacs commands. So yeah, that is weird. I'm gonna make a note. Text edit. Let me actually do that myself. So if I go back. So my text edit didn't mess it up. I don't know why your text edit, like mine is not messing it up, it's able to do it. And that's exactly what you have, right? Like that's pretty much what it looks like? That's so weird.
Yeah, for some reason it says there's no routes. It sees this file and it says there's no routes.
I think he's right. It must be just a file type.
Yeah, I don't know. That's really annoying. Okay. Well, so I'll try to move on to the next thing. So any other questions? So in the last half an hour, basically, I'm going to look at a facility within Rails that like simplifies a lot of the tasks that we just did, right? So what we did was we kind of did everything by hand, right? So we defined the route. We then said like, here's the route that we're going to use. Here we created the controller file and the class code and all that. So we actually did all of that by hand. But instead, what Rails lets you do is that it lets you actually create a lot of these files automatically. And the way it lets you do that is through a command that's called Rails generate. And like I said, we used Rails for creating the application and for starting a server, but you can also use it to automate a lot of processes. So I'm basically going to spend the next half an hour like talking a little bit about that aspect of Rails and like what it means to actually automate a lot of the pieces of building an application. So basically what we have is we have this app, right? And if I was to type in a different city name, if I said something like San Francisco, it's going to say, I don't know. That's because in my code, I said if the city name is set to Oakland, then say Jean Quan. But if it's not Oakland, then I don't know, right? Obviously, I can say something like else if params city name equal to San Francisco. And then I can set mirror name equal to that. Now if I refresh this, hey, I got a little bit more data. But this is obviously not how you're going to write your app. You're going to write your app to like have a database in which like you store all the mayors and all the cities. You want then your app to be able to easily set information about a city, easily like set information about a mayor, and like you want all of that to be part of your application. And so what Rails comes with is a framework for making it very easy to manipulate data about objects. Okay. In Rails, these objects are referred to as resources. So a lot of the terminology calls them resources rather than objects, but it's basically a way to think of like, here's all the things I want to manipulate, like books. I want to have a way to manipulate books, or I want a way to manipulate users. Each user consists of these properties, and I want to be able to set those properties. And there's lots of like very common ways in which we do this, right? Like we use forms to like type in information, drop downs, etc. And Rails comes with a lot of like easy tools to let you do that. So I'll sort of give you a sense of what some of those tools are, but that's really like you can learn like a whole lot of stuff depending on how complex your application is going to be. So basically the way you do that is you do something called generating a scaffold. And your scaffold is essentially going to give you a lot of tools that let you manipulate objects or resources. Okay? And the way the scaffold command works is that you type in, let me change this window a little bit so it's all within the screen. You type in Rails generate scaffold, and then you type in the name of the object you want to manipulate, and then you type in the properties that you want this object to have. So if I have a city, let's say I want to give it two different properties, which are the name and the population. Right? So every city is going to have a name, and every city is going to have a population. Okay? But when you generate a scaffold, not only do you have to name your properties, you also have to say what data type those properties are. Okay? So the scaffold command lets you define different types of objects in your system or different types of resources in your system, and requires that you provide attributes and the data types for those objects.
This is going to go into the database?
Yes.
And city is the name of the scaffold.
Yes. But more than that, and I'll get there in a minute. For now, yes, city is the name of the scaffold, which is like a whole lot of stuff that lets you manipulate this information about a city using the Rails framework. Okay? So I encourage you to type that in and try and follow along a little bit from here. Yes?
What happens if I jump the gun and don't tell it what like each variable is?
I will generate another scaffold, which is just a dummy, and attempt to not give it any. Is this what you mean? Like, what if I had done this?
Yeah.
It should give me an error saying I have properties without types. That's interesting. It did not.
Mine worked perfectly as well.
I think the answer is it assumes that if you don't give it a type, it will default to strings. I did not know that, because I always specify the data types of my resources. If you don't specify your resources, properties, data types, string. Because we happen to notice that, let me emphasize that Rails has a lot of defaults. So it's good and bad, right? You're like, oh, I'm so happy I don't have to type in :string for all of my string properties. But it's also a real bad idea, because if you mistakenly left out the type, Rails didn't actually throw an error. It would have been much better if Rails had said, hey, you forgot a type, are you sure? But Rails doesn't do that, convention or configuration. It tends to just say, oh, I'm sure you meant this. I'm going to keep moving. And you won't notice it until much later, when you thought you typed in integer and now you have to go fix it, and now you don't know where to fix it. So defaults are good, but then sometimes they're really bad. But Rails has a lot of defaults. So in the beginning, I would say, like, try and stick with the formats that are being supplied, just because if you don't, then Rails will do things you won't be able to anticipate. Was there a question? Okay, so when you ran that, if you're able to run it correctly, you should have seen a lot of stuff being output. Let me point out what just happened. The two things I want to point out, notice first of all, if you go back to the app folder, there is now a new file called city folder called cities. If you go to models, we didn't see this the last time. There's now a new file called city.rb. Rails has basically started inserting pieces of code for you.
And it's also left my cap and not run this.
That is funny. It shouldn't have.
Migrations are pending.
Ah, okay. Yeah, okay, yes, it would say that. So I haven't gotten there yet. So that's the first thing I wanted to point out, is that remember that we had by hand created the city underscore controller, but this time Rails created some of that for you, and if you look inside this tiny like preview window, it says class cities controller less than application controller, which is exactly the same code we wrote when we hand wrote it. So it's like Rails is kind of like giving you all of this stuff for free. It's also giving you a lot of other stuff that's going on, but it's essentially the same as the code that we were trying to write by hand. Okay. Okay. So if you go back to the browser application and you try to refresh it, as you noticed, you will get this error, which says migrations are pending. How many folks are at the error? You're there, you're there, you're there, you're there. Awesome. Okay, good. No, Deepthi? Where are you at? Let's see if we can catch you up.
I'm stuck.
Oh, okay. Well, maybe I can. Yeah, I'll try to give you some help later. So the other thing it did, other than filling in all these files, is that it added files inside a folder called dbmigrate.
You want to show your schema?
That string and integer. So what it did here, ignore this file. I'm just going to delete it, just so it's not confusing. So, okay. So what the scaffold generation did is not only did it set up all the code with which you're going to manipulate your data, it also set up the code with which you're going to initialize your database. The code that Rails uses to initialize your database are called migrations. Okay. So if you've done any kind of database programming, you know that you have to do a lot of stuff to actually initialize and set up your database. You have to create your tables. You have to name the columns in your tables. You have to create indexes for your tables. What else do you have to do? You have to initialize the database itself. So there's a lot of you have to set up the encoding for the database. Rails does all of that for you through the migrations. And all you have to do is go back to your screen and type in rake db:/migrate. And any changes to the database that are pending, any migrations that are pending, will be run by Rails. What this also means is that it's very easy to duplicate databases, right? So you set up your database on your system, your buddy wants to help you program, you give the code to her, she starts setting up. All she has to do is run your migrations, and it initializes her database to the same state that yours is in. So that's what migrations do. And Rails is smart enough, if like, you know, she's been working on the code for a while, and you've been making changes to the database, Rails is smart enough to notice the differences and only make the changes that are new. Okay, so if you add new tables and you say, hey, I made some changes to the database, Rails will look at your migrations, compare those to what she has, and actually only add the new stuff. Yeah.
The migrate operation is only for the structure of the database, not for data.
That is correct. That is correct. Yeah. So the way you ran the migrate operation is, remember I said that there are essentially two commands that you should care about, plus bundle. The bundle is not hopefully something you don't have to do much. Rails and rake. Rails is used pretty much for only three things. It's used to create applications in the beginning. It's used to start up your server. It's used to generate a lot of automatic code like we saw. And pretty much everything else is what is called a rake task. And Rails comes with a set of tasks that do a lot of stuff. They initialize your database structure. They help you add data to your database. They help you deploy it to the cloud. So if you want to have your application running on Amazon S3, there is a gem for that. There's a Rails library, which are called gems, which will insert new tasks into your rake files, which will help you deploy. So the documentation will say, use this gem. Here's the rake task. And the name of the rake task is S3:deploy. And if that's the name of the rake task, then you would say something like that. So a lot of gems come with ways of doing things, and what they do is they all essentially give you new rake tasks. So the rake task here is called db:/migrate. There are some tasks that come automatically with Rails, and if you say rake space -t, it will show them to you. So you can see that the names are, many of them are sort of intuitive, like create your database, drop the database, do the migrations, tell me what the current status of my migrations is, do a rollback, etc., etc. Okay. So once I ran this, I'm going to run another rake task called routes. And notice that it has added a bunch of patterns that look a lot like the pattern that we hand-coded. So one of the things that Generate Scaffold does is that it says, I will now respond to a whole lot of new routes, which are in this pattern. Okay? And the way it did that was that it actually modified your routes file and added, let me delete that dummy thing, added this line in the routes file that says resources. So basically what happened when you ran the scaffold generation, let me recount all the things that happened. It added files in the controller folder. It added a new folder in views and added a bunch of files in there. It added migrations. Your routes file. So it basically automated this whole process for you. It added new patterns that your application will now respond to. Corresponding to each of those patterns, it added code that will handle those patterns. And corresponding to each of those code snippets, it added views files that will generate data.
So it's not going to do that like every time we change like the fields in our database, right? It's only because we ask for a scaffold and scaffold and scaffold.
Yeah, that's a good question. So recap the question. Now that your scaffold is set up, changes you continue to make after this point are still going to have to be hand-coded by you. There is really no way to keep updating your scaffold as you make changes to your database. So you kind of get this one-shot deal with the automated part, which means that in general you want to like save time and think a little bit ahead, right? So my city resource only has two properties, a name and a population. What if I want to add the transit authority name, for example? Sorry, what did you say?
I think elevation.
Elevation. Okay, elevation. Yes, that's a much better one, actually. Transit authority was a stupid example. Yeah, elevation. Okay, I now have to go do by hand everything that I was able to do with one shot by generate scaffold, which means I'm essentially going to have to do the stuff we did at the beginning, 1.5 hours. Change your controller file, add a new migration, change the view file to handle the elevation when it displays that data, update your database, change all your existing data. You already had cities with names and population. Who's going to put the elevation information there? So yes, the scaffold is a handy thing, but once you've done it, now you're back to coding. So it gets you quite far, but not very far.
What if you had like a different kind of resource that you wanted to also generate a scaffold for, like other than cities?
You can just keep adding resources. In fact, I will do that. I will generate a scaffold for mayors, because remember, our app was supposed to give you mayors for cities. We only just built one for city. So I could say something like, mayor has a name, mayor has an age, mayor has, I don't know, salary, right, data pointed. Notice that Rails comes with certain default data types, so you can add those data types. So once again, if you wanted to add this resource, all I do is generate the scaffold, finish my pending migration, notice that the migration now only created a table in the database for mayors because it knows that the city's migration was done already, right? So it's keeping track for you. Now, if I look at the routes using my routes task, it will say that not only will your application respond to a bunch of routes for cities, it will also respond to a bunch of routes for mayors.
That's an awful lot of like potential URLs and things. Users might get all that stuff. But we don't want exposure and stuff. We just want that behind the scenes.
So for defining your routes, called RESTful conventions, which says that you must, it is good practice to have many different routes for each of the things you would want to do with a typical resource. You would want to update a resource, you would want to create a new resource, you would want to view a resource, you would want to view a whole list of resources. And what did I say? Create, read, update, delete would be the things you would want to do. Those four, create, read, update, delete, are commonly referred to as the CRUD actions of RESTful routes. Rails CRUD. Create, read, update, delete, CRUD. Rails follows the convention that when you create a resource, you want to have different routes, different patterns for each of these. So that's why it creates all of these, because it's just good coding practice. It makes your routes very easy to read. So in practice, what this means is that if I go back to my application, I can say /cities. And Rails has done a whole bunch of stuff in the scaffold that simply says, I know that there's a pattern called /cities. Let me show both these windows so you can see all of the patterns. So here's in my routes list, I have /cities is a pattern that your Rails application understands. And what that does is it lists all of the cities in the database. We actually didn't initialize our database with any data, so there are no cities. But Rails will give you an HTML file that helpfully has a link to creating a new city. And notice that the link is pointing to a route, which is already available in your routes file.
Check that out.
So if I type in city/new, Rails will generate a form that corresponds to the properties that you already defined to start with. Along with a whole bunch of like helpful things, like the labels are uppercased, capitalized words. So you said the property was name, the label starts with name. So to answer, re-answer your question, if I was to add new data, elevation, at that point I would have to go and actually change the file to add elevation, right? There's no magic way to automate that process. You got one shot to create the scaffold, now you have to code after that. But I could say, here's my city. City has this population. Notice that it also adds this little browser thing, which lets you like go up and down with the number, because you said that it's a number. That's why the form element is created with a little up and down arrow button that lets you change the number. Yeah.
How does it know? We told it to generate a scaffold for a resource called city.
Yeah.
So how does it know that it's cities?
It doesn't know that. It's actually a convention. So here's another convention in Rails that in the beginning will trip a lot of people up. Notice that the name of the controller is a plural of the name of the resource. The name of the views folder is the plural of the name of the resource.
Very strange.
But how does it know that it's IE instead of just adding an S at the end? It's like a dictionary.
But the name of the model, which is what you're going to use to actually control the database, is singular. Convention, convention, convention. In the beginning, you'll be like, wait, was it the model is plural? And but you just have to remember, controller and views will be plural, and.
But we didn't tell that.
We didn't tell it cities at any point.
Yeah.
So how does it know that?
I'm now going to do.
Oh no.
You're going to add person. Is it going to call it people?
No way.
So this is an aspect of Rails. This is an aspect of Rails that is merely cute and serves no real purpose. I think was that. Yeah, it is awesome. The thing, and it confuses a lot of beginners. So the reason I think it's cute is because it's confusing. And I think like the confusing aspect of it is worse than the benefits. Now the benefit is that the way you're supposed to think of your application is that every table in your database contains all the information about a specific resource. So the name of your table is going to be the plural. Because you should think, where's all my data about my cities? Oh, it's in my cities table. Where's the controller that handles my cities? Oh, it's my cities controller. Right? It's it's trying to use the names to be as intuitive as possible, right? So you kind of say, oh, wait, where did I store information about a person? Oh, in the table with all the people. So the name of the table is people, the name of controllers is people, is because the controller is responsible for handling all the resources. That's why it is pluralized. But it is annoying when you don't know that it's going to do that, because I once had a model which ended in the letter Y, and I didn't want it to be IES, and I wrote a lot of code assuming it was going to be like, I forget what it was, like I think it was like it was not an actual English word. It was just some random word that ended in Y. And I wrote my code assuming that the plural would just be YS. but it was not, and I had to go back and change all my code. Another thing is like another convention that got me once in the beginning when I was coding is none of your resources can be called asset. Okay? Because notice that one of the folders inside app is called assets. If you ever make the mistake of calling one of your resources asset, your application will cease to work at certain points. Not everywhere. It will mostly work, and then it'll throw these really weird errors, and that's because like Rails got confused between assets, the plural, that it made, and the fact that one of its folders is called assets, and it gets really confused. So conventional configuration it's great in a lot of cases, but it can like kind of bite you. Okay, well, that was. I mean, I was going a little bit slower today than usual. Like I try to get to the point where we actually make changes in the database and we look at like how Rails does that. So we didn't get there, but we essentially covered like the aspects of all of the Rails coding you would do.
Can you show us how to look up the mayor's name and the city?
Okay, so let me just like walk around the application that I just created, right? So now we know that if I want to look at all the mayors. I would do that. Oh, did I not finish? Sorry about that. So I could add a new mayor. Notice that not only does it give me numbers for but because one of the fields was date, it gives me drop downs, right? So that's really cool because now I can like manipulate that like this.
You didn't have us generate a scaffold for the mayor, did you?
I had, yeah.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, I had generated. And in my scaffold, I said date appointed is a date time data type. That's why it automatically gives me this screen with the drop downs for date. Again, these are defaults, right? So you can see the default is spanning like 5 years before, 5 years after. And if you want to change that, you have to go back and change it. Notice that once you set that value, you can actually look at individual mayors using this route. So if I say mayor/1, I get the first mayor I created. If I say city/1, I get the first city I created. If I say city/2, it will complain that there's no record in the database because I haven't created a second city yet. What we didn't have the time to do, which I wish I could have done, was in this, using the scaffold, we haven't connected cities with mayors. And so that's a whole topic called associations, and that would have taken some time, but I was going a little bit slower, so we couldn't really get to that. Cool. Well, so the Rails classes are, this is the only intro level class. If you guys have suggestions for like specific things you want to do, if you want to have like kind of the next step of this class, like email us at team@railsschool. If there's enough interest, we might try to like, if I would say like if like 10 people said they would show up, like I might be convinced to come over here from Oakland. Which I live in Oakland. I don't work in the city anymore, so I don't like getting on BART. But if I get enough people wanting to show up, I would be happy to do so. If there's enough of you in Oakland and you want to meet in Oakland, I actually have venues there that I could rustle up, so I would be very happy to teach in Oakland. Like I said, the friend of mine and I are thinking of starting group sessions. The format of the group sessions is actually more for like intermediate, I would say, than like basic beginners, because it's more like you already know what you're doing, you're working with someone, but you need guidance along the way. So it's targeted more for someone who's mostly a self-learner but wants to like speed up the process. And it's not really a pure beginner's class. I actually taught one for about 3 months, and it ended up being way more work than I expected. So I'm taking a bit of a step back from that. If you're interested, let me know. Like email me and say like, hey, I would like a more pure beginner's class. We can definitely talk about it.
Yeah, so what kind of
The intermediate curriculum, we're still working on it. The idea would be that I can talk about the beginner's curriculum if you want, but the intermediate stuff is we'll be like, oh, okay, you want to build this app, you should read this, you should read this, you should read this. You'll be working with someone else, and we'll meet weekly to help you move along faster. But it'll be based on your idea, so you'll have to be motivated by something you already want. Depends on how many people sign up. We've got a couple of people interested right now, so it kind of depends. But let me know if you want to do it, if you know someone you would like to program with. I would love to, yeah. So Samir@railschool.org. Just give me a holler. The other two people that signed up are probably more beginner than you.
I'm pretty beginner.
Well, you coded before, so that's already pretty. Oh, okay. I thought maybe I got you confused with someone else. Oh, okay. I was trying to keep track. Okay. Yeah. Well, maybe yeah. The other two guys have not really coded much before, so they might be at 6 speed or something. So yeah. Was there another question? Okay, guys. I'm gonna wrap up. Shoot me an email, and thanks for coming. And NoiseBridge is awesome. Check out their other classes. Donate. Keep the space going. Thanks.
How many classes is it? How many
We haven't figured out any of that stuff. So the beginner's class, we taught 12 classes. It was 3 hours a week of class plus about 12 hours of homework. So it's much more, yeah. It was pretty, yeah. So here's what I found. My beginners, I had about 4 of them.